Okay, welcome everyone to the LinkedIn Live. I'm going to do a quick opening. I'm going to introduce our two guests today, and then we'll get into our topics. So, this panel is going to be on learning from failure, embracing setbacks as a valuable growth lesson. We're going to explore a little bit about how failure can transform into powerful learning opportunities. Our guests here are going to talk a little about their experiences as leaders inside businesses and share some of their stories and experiences there. And really, our goal here is to talk about how failure can be a source of growth and resilience and ultimately success. So I'm excited for this as a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I know also to our guests. I will mention for those that are watching live on LinkedIn, we're going to be watching the comment section. If you have a comment or a question, throw it in there. I'll try to watch that. We'll try to address those as they come up. Also, if you're on YouTube, jump over on LinkedIn if you want to make comments there. With that, let's meet our panelists. So first up, I'd like to introduce Mike Fisher. Mike is CEO of MyFitnessPal and is a technology leader with a rich history in guiding both startups and Fortune 500 companies. He's known for driving innovation, building a positive, high-performance organization culture. Our second panelist, John Williams. John is a seasoned fractional executive and technology consultant, over 2 decades of experience, and he has guided many top companies through strategic roadmaps, planning, technology architecture, business alignment. I think we've got a lot of failure between the three of us that we can talk about. And I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm a strategic coach. I work with companies on helping them plan their growth and exits, and really interested in this topic. I think it's core to all growth and all learning processes. So with that, I'd like to get started with just an initial question of how do you kind of define failure? Because I think that's a lot of kind of the challenge here. What does failure mean, or how do you kind of define it inside businesses? Mike, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to John. And I'd love to get just an intro idea on that.
Yeah, and Bruce, thanks for having me here. John, great to see you. I think one of the ways to think about this, as you've kind of hinted to, it's in the title of like reframing that idea of failure into a learning opportunity. I think that's important here, is that we can talk about ways to do that in terms of our processes and our speed. And by doing things much smaller, we can turn stuff that in the past we would have sort of framed in failures because we'd put a lot of effort, a lot of energy into it, and it had to work because it was such high stakes. We can reframe all of that by doing stuff differently, and then it becomes learning opportunities. So I would prefer us if we could move away from this idea of a failure into how do we learn from it and not even define it.
Yeah. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Mike on turning failure on its head. But also, what is failure? It's really a missed expectation. Whatever it is, an expectation of a project delivery, an expectation of a project outcome. And in IT, the statistics in successful projects is relatively low, even to launch.
Yeah.
And then also personal expectation, like keeping my job. So that could be a missed expectation right there. Again, I agree with Mike. There's stuff to be learned from failure, but let's call it like it is.
Yeah, I think that for me, failure is always that. To kind of, John, to your point, it's a misexpectation, right? It's not necessarily that we failed. It's that, okay, well, we set a goal, and all goals have some element of risk or uncertainty, and we've realized some uncertainty. Like we didn't achieve everything we set out to do, but is that really expected or not expected? I think is what kind of frames this failure conversation. I'd love to talk a little bit about just culturally. What do you need inside of a culture, either a team or a department or a company, to really even be able to tackle this, right? Because I find that some companies or some situations, it's very kind of, if not easy, at least practical to kind of have this conversation around failure. In other cases, it's really, really hard, right? Like even talking about the idea that we're going to talk about failure is just like starts to raise hairs and stuff. What do you notice? And I'll let either one of you chime in here. What do you notice about cultures that really embrace this and cultures that don't?
Yeah, I'll give a small example. I think Mike's going to have a bigger example. So one of my clients, a CFO at a small company, was working with the IT team, and they were going slow. And, they were delivering about 5 projects a year. And she said, well, what if you delivered 8, but you failed on 1 or 2 instead of delivering a 5? So she wanted them to go faster. They couldn't do it. And then I came in. I said, hey, you have leadership open to failure and learning. You should take advantage of that. But this, for the IT leader, they just couldn't. They were just wired to never fail. So they'd be clearly being yelled at so many times, like never have the system go down, never have it fail. So what I'm saying is you really need permission from the top. Without permission, you need that air cover. And if you're lucky, it's from the CEO or the CFO, or maybe it's just the CTO is doing that shepherding. I know, Mike, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, John, I think, you described it perfectly. What I think about, we would probably use, the term fear. That like, whether this is a personal failure, like you said, like I've made a mistake personally, or as a team, we didn't achieve something. I think the reason, culturally is people fear failure, and they're trained that way. Their bosses treat it that way. We would probably use the term psychological safety is what we need culturally. And I hope John gets to describe one of the exercises that he invented and has taken me and many of my teams through of this fishbowl, which is an exercise about thinking really, really deeply about failure. And you can't even sometimes mention that without, like you said, you just, you get the immediate reaction of like, hold on, we're going to start this project by talking about failure. Like that seems, bad and fearful and stuff like that. But you need this culture where, and John's right, all the way to the top, that supports the psychological safety, that flips failure on its head and says, no, these are learning opportunities.
Yeah, John, tell us a little bit about the exercise.
Yeah. So what I learned is I've had a lot of failures in my career. So how can we pass that on, but without people having similar failures?
Let's fail in new ways rather than the same ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Like systems, I don't wish those failures. So the exercise we did is we came up with a way to have people imagine a future failure. So it's a 2-part exercise. The first part of the exercise is imagine you're traveling in a time machine a year ahead, and a project has failed or something has failed, and you're writing yourself an email of why the project failed. And we did this. It's quiet time. We wrote the email. Some people wrote, I lost my job. The company failed, whatever it was. And then that really started to give them permission to think about failure. And then that was the first part. Then the second part of the workshop is we took a real project, and we imagined it failing. So pre-mortem, but this is a little different. And what we had so much permission. By the way, it took a lot of time to give people permission.
Yeah.
So you presented a project, a couple of slides, and then you said, here are a few ways I think it would fail. You would then go on mute. That's the fishbowl aspect that Mike mentioned. And everyone else had permission to pile on the worst possible ways that the project was going to fail. And what was interesting, here was the biggest takeaway. When you're presenting a project and you present your risks, and someone says, oh, what about this? You go, I've thought about that. You weren't allowed to do that. So because you were on mute for 30 minutes, you couldn't defend it. And then people would pile on.
Yeah.
Right.
That point right there is so important. Like, because we're so afraid to fail, we defend in these tiny little ways you don't even notice. Like in a conversation, if John brought up an idea, I'd be like, I'm so afraid of failing that I start defending it, and it distracts him from like digging in further. And when you're in the fishbowl and you're on mute and everybody's talking, you can't defend it. And all of a sudden you get to go pretty deep on like ways that possibly could fail. And that's where the learnings come from.
Yeah. We do this exercise, call it cloaking, and in coaching, where you'll have a group session and someone will present a problem, and then they've got to turn around and they can listen, but they can't see, and and everyone else talks about the problem. And it's incredible what actually gets spoken in those situations when you change that dynamic, because it's about protecting your ego.
Yeah. And the feedback we got from one of the first team members that did it is So what was that like? He's like, you just mentioned everything that I think about in the shower most mornings that keep me awake, that I'm worried about. Like, you gave me permission. He's like, I'm supposed to push those thoughts out of my head.
Yeah.
You gave me permission to engage them and figure out, and then you start to think about solutions after that. So,
well, I not to make too many kind of sports analogies. I have a tendency to do sports analogies, but I do a lot of climbing, and one of the things we practice in climbing, and we kind of have to do it on a regular basis, is lead when you're exposed on the rope and you fall, and you can have a 10-foot fall, and you're on the rope, it's all safe, but that feeling of just like losing your grip and that free fall. But the problem is, if you are so worried about that, it will affect your ability to actually climb, right? Because if you are too sensitized, and desensitizing yourself to that fall actually allows you to be a better climber. So I think there's something in this, which is by kind of engaging in that feeling, that visceral feeling of talking about failure and talking about what could go wrong, and then being sort of comfortable with that discussion actually allows you to then deal with those issues more productively, and you're not locked up.
Yeah, Bruce, I agree. Like that, how we opened and talked about, like, if we could change the way we work so that our failures weren't massive.
Yeah.
And you start to, exactly like in your climbing example, like, you don't want to take a massive fall, you want to take a small one and get used to that. And all of a sudden you become comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ideal situation in a company and organization, is fail in these really small ways. And you turn that failure into something that, oh no, I'm learning. I'm just learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is there like one thing? So I do a lot of quarterly planning with companies, and we set these goals. And I'm always kind of helping them dial in the level of stretch they're putting into their objectives. And I always say I want it to be doable but not easy. And at the end of the quarter, if they've achieved everything, I'm kind of like, okay, guys, like you left gas in the tank, right? Like we probably didn't stretch enough. But on the flip side, though, if they get less than 50% done, it's frustrating, right? Like when we probably spent a lot of time spinning our wheels on things that we could have reallocated and got more things done. I guess, how do you kind of dial in kind of the amount of failure you want a team or a situation to have, such that it's learning without being kind of overly demoralizing for the group?
John, do you have an answer to that?
Not yet. I'm thinking of one while you're answering.
I mean, I think I was going to go with, like, I think there's guidelines, right? We talk about stretch goals, and you should have an 85% likelihood of hitting them and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think the reality is, ideally, we're stretching more and more. So we're starting to get, maybe it starts with like, oh, this is a 98% likely hit. And then as the team gets comfortable with that failure, you stretch and stretch more. That's how big things happen and you can occur, but you do have to get comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's another technique kind of related to failure, which is concept of quitting. I mean,
okay.
Jesus,
Tell me more.
So there's a great book by Annie Duke, former poker player, who now advises governments and corporations on quit, how to know when to walk away, how to be successful. So if part of failure can be the concept that there's a quit under a certain condition, that makes it a little, so teams never have that. They say, we're going to hit this goal.
Mm-hmm.
They don't come up with the reasons to stop going after that goal. So there's this concept of a quit criteria. So, and it's interesting, if you remember the Osama bin Laden, when they were chasing him, the general said they had 3 quit criteria, that if they met this criteria on any day, they immediately abandoned the mission. Yeah. So it's like having, in Annie Duke's book, she talks about climbing Everest, and the people who had quit criteria and followed it lived, but you don't know them. The people who didn't follow the quit criteria.
Yeah, I can tell my story. So I climbed, or we made an attempt at Ama Dablam, which is the peak just south of Everest, and we got to 21,000 feet and had to quit. And it was a lot of those things. Like once a couple of things happened, the level of risk goes up dramatically, and you've got a window. And ours was about an hour to make some decisions on how we were going to get out of this situation. And it was interesting how quickly it went from, oh God, this is a pain, to like, oh wait, we are now in a situation we need to make some really serious decisions quickly, and the whole summit fever thing kicks in. So I love that idea of the quick criteria. I'm going to bring up another one of
by the
Andy's.
way, someone
Yeah.
just said like a stop loss on a financial
Oh, yeah.
transaction. I think that's a perfect example. So,
Yeah, we've got some good comments here. I love someone just mentioning some of the work that they've done with John.
And it's interesting. I was just thinking too, another analogy for failure, and when you have other people tell you failure, is people who bet on the don't come line in craps. Right? You ever play craps and everyone's betting for the win, and then some people bet against the win. It's funny that in finance and gambling we know this, but we don't apply them in projects. So projects are so positive. We just have to have a positive attitude in everything we say.
The expectation is always win.
Yeah.
The thing I was going to bring up from Annie's book, and I love her work, is, and it kind of goes to like once you've had a failure, or once you're kind of through the situation and looking at the other side and retrospecting, kind of distinguish it between kind of good and bad decisions and good and bad outcomes. And sometimes you can have a failure. So you made all the right decisions, and you still have a failure because there's always uncertainty, there's always risk, there's things that happen, versus, oh, I actually made a bad decision that led to failure, and vice versa. I can have a bad decision that actually works out, and then I have a bad decision that leads to failure. Like how do you help teams, organizations kind of tease apart kind of decisions and things they did from the outcomes, and kind of be able to trace back and say, well, this failure actually shows us something we did wrong, versus this failure was the result of a low probability event occurring that resulted in a failure, but we shouldn't really do anything differently next time.
Yeah. The kind of where I go with helping teams on this is getting an outside perspective. Okay. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, Bruce, is you have your tools, you have your knowledge, you approach a project, but you're missing something.
Yeah.
Like there's something you don't know. And there's a quote from Reid Hoffman that I love, just came up again recently, which is farm for dissent.
Ooh.
Right. So usually we have a project and we're pitching it. Say, yes, give me money, give me team, give me resources. He's like, no, you should be having those people in your network who are telling you everything that's wrong with your project. That's the failure mode.
Yeah.
So
it's like a murder board in
murder board. I hadn't heard of that. That's cool.
Yeah. Mike, what are your thoughts on how to help kind of teams distinguish between, failures and decisions?
Yeah. The thing that came to mind for me was like product development teams.
Okay.
And they're in a space in which they're going to fail in terms of delivering an outcome that's positive in metrics and customer value more often than not, right? So if you look at any of the big studies of companies that have published their results of their A/B experiments, Netflix, Microsoft, all of these, a full 50% are neutral. They don't do anything. Probably close to 35% are actually harmful. They actually cause some impact to a metric or to the customer experience that's negative. And then, that last 15 or 20% is positive. And these are not just random ideas. These are ideas that people put a lot of thought into, and they're trying them as an experiment to see if it improves, hopefully improves. So product teams are in this all the time, in this world in which more than likely it's not going to be successful. And I think as they do their retros and are thinking about this, it's not, did this fail? Like certainly you can set up the experiment poorly or do something that caused it. And that's when I think you would look back and say, okay, how do we improve this? The other is, and that's what I learned. So I don't do that again. When I set up my experiment, how do I learn from that I didn't mess it up? Mm-hmm. The other side is most of these aren't going to work. But again, how do we learn from it? What are we learning that we now put back into the next experiment or the one after that? And so whether it's something that's almost guaranteed, percentage-wise going to not work and not be successful, or something that we actually made a mistake, either way, I think there's opportunities from learning. But back to like our discussion on culture, you've got to have a culture that it's willing to admit we made a mistake, we didn't set up the experiment properly, or what are we going to learn from this, and not treat it as like a real failure.
Yeah, I do think there's a difference, or I've certainly seen cases where we want to design this experiment, or we have this thesis, or we're going to run this experiment design where we kind of want to hit this 50-50 probability, or we're not sure. Like it could go either way, because that's going to sort of maximize the learning, right? Like if 50-50 and we go one way, well, it's going to knock out a whole 50% of our options. Whereas if we're 98% sure it's going to work and it works, we don't get much information, right? So there's this kind of intentional experiment design versus, hey, I've got business critical, mission critical work that needs to get done. I need to have a fair, a high degree of certainty around it. Failure would be, very painful, if not catastrophic, and I need to kind of manage that differently. I guess, how do you help, or where do you see teams or situations where they're not applying this kind of experiment design kind of strategy to the process?
Let me give you an IT example.
Yeah.
Mike, maybe do a product one. So one of my favorite ones is when I get a tech team gives me a presentation or a case for a system on implementation, and there's one choice. And I just dismiss them out of hand. Yeah. I'm like, no, you got to give me 3 choices, like A, B, and C, and what are the pros and cons of each one comparatively. I think that kind of addresses that. That's the win all or nothing is just the wrong approach. And for teams to start to understand, these are just choices and guesses.
Yeah, I think the all or nothing, you're exactly right. That like, this is back to these projects. We shouldn't be doing these 12, 18-month projects where it's got to be all or nothing, because that is when we can break these down into small increments that we learn along the way. And that way we get many, many times, we think about it as at-bats. I want to take many at-bats. I don't want a single time where I've got to hit a home run, or else like, there's a lot of pressure. I don't want that. I want it where I can take a lot of swings at bat. That means doing tiny, small experiments along the way. So I agree, John. Like, no, we need lots of opportunities to learn from this.
Yeah. So we've mentioned retrospectives a couple of different times. Like, what are some good kind of habits, structures, processes in terms of doing that, kind of reflection, the retrospecting on work? What have you noticed in terms of good strategies, good habits with teams that do retrospectives well?
I would probably also start by saying that I personally think of a postmortem differently than a retrospective.
Okay.
But I think you can use a lot of the same tools and and sort of processes in both. One of which is the timeline, to really understand the timeline and when decisions were made. Often people will think about, right, especially if it's a postmortem on an incident, they think about the time in which they're working on it. Yeah. And by doing ahead of time, usually, and getting the timeline, you realize that like there's oftentimes lots and lots of work that happened well ahead, days, weeks, maybe, ahead of this, that have to be included in here because decisions were made back then. And instead of thinking just this, hour that we're fighting the incident or something, think about the whole time period. So I think that would be one, is really good timelines is very useful.
Yeah. To do a proper postmortem, it's really the forensics of the timeline is key. And then when I was doing it in person, I would write up on the whiteboard to start. I would have no blame. And then I would write this. I got this from a developer, no shame. Right. So no shame what you did, no shaming others, so it's learning, and going through that. I actually did a timeline for an organization on a failed massive government sales event. And we did, but the timeline was critical, and no one, there was 9 different participants and none of them knew the timeline. And when they put it all together, they saw relations and associations that, if I had only known that at the time, that was their learning. So they hadn't been communicating effectively on it.
And then the same thing about whether it's a retro or a postmortem or anything else, that blamelessness, the psychological safety, you've got to have that. Otherwise, people won't open up about the decisions that they made. And if it's going to turn into a blame game or something, or finger pointing, you've got to have that to have that open, honest conversations.
Yeah, I love the timelines. I'll do these timelines with teams, and I'll have them all do it independently, or I'll have like small groups do it, and they'll put it together, and their timelines are all over the place, right? Like people put events like weeks apart from each other, and then we start having these conversations, and people realize, oh yeah, no, that really was here. Oh, that happened before that. Oh yeah, I didn't like people's memories. Like it just memory is horribly infallible, right? Like people do not remember things very well. And until you start getting data on the board and stuff, like there's huge learnings around that.
Well, it's also stress. It's usually, it was a stressful situation, right?
Absolutely.
So you've got adrenaline and stress come into play as well.
Time dilation, right? Like, oh yeah, that was an hour. And like, no, that was only 15 minutes, right? Like it's like, because of that, the how your brain kind of compresses and extends time based on that. I want to kind of dig into this psychological safety. What are some practical things that you see teams, leaders, and teams do to create more psychological safety? Because I think everyone talks about the need for it, but it's really hard to put in place.
My favorite one was at the beginning of Agile in the .com. Dan Woods, who's a CTO that we know, and he had failure Fridays. So, and every Friday in their meeting, they would talk about who had the biggest failure, and he actually had a trophy. So the person from last week would hand the failure trophy to the person who had the failure, and then they would talk about learnings. But it's like failing safe and failing fast rather than not talking about failure. So that's one of the techniques. I don't know, Mike, if you've seen.
I do think getting comfortable and with that. So I love the idea of failure Fridays. John and I have done this where people, that have had more failures in our careers come and talk about them.
Yeah.
And making it and help people understand that like it's going to happen and it's okay. It's part of the process that, I've used this like, and I was talking to someone a little more junior and said like, you see some of us and hopefully we're not in a final form, but it appears as if we're in a final form. And like, but like we have decades of learnings from failures.
I got fired over failures. I mean, you can't get a worse failure than that. Yeah. So,
right. So you look at John, you're like, oh, John knows so much and he's done all this great stuff. John has stuff in his background that like he's seen a lot of stuff and learned from these failures, and that is why he's successful today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, I was going to say, I think the most powerful ones I've seen is when leaders, are quite vulnerable about, the failures that they've had and then what they've learned from it, right? Like how they've, both kind of recovered psychologically, right? Like, okay, yeah, this was a hit. I had to do some soul searching on how this was going to impact me, what I need to do differently, like what contributed to that, right? In terms of my own biases, assumptions, lack of experience, lack of knowledge, and then how they use that to drive their development, right? Like, and that led me to do these things. That led me to change my approach to this stuff, or to, change an assumption that I've made about the world, or about the team, or about the project.
I'm just looking at the comments. I want to address, because we're talking about fail fast, fail safe, and support from the top. What if you don't have support from the top, right? You are going to get fired, or some other retribution. It could be small, medium, large. So really, as your own leader, if you're in a leadership role, you can do this without it necessarily coming from the top. Then what you have to do with the team is the team owns all the successes and you own all the failures.
Yeah.
It's the only way that it works, right? And so maybe it's not cultural in your entire organization, but you could do it under your sphere of influence. Mike, I saw you nodding your head.
No, I totally agree. Like you as the leader, whatever level that is, need to provide that for. Hopefully it goes all the way up and it's your boss as well. If not, you can still provide that for your organization. I mean, 2 quick stories if we have the time for it.
Good.
Like, so back, in my early PayPal days, early 2000s, that's 20 plus years ago, we were trying to split a monolithic database, and we implemented this thing called a multi-phase commit, which was super complex, took months and months, one of these big projects. It did not go well. And leadership came down and people were just ducking, hiding. Yeah. And you're right, this took months of like just people cowering and not wanting to be part of this, because people were out for, to find who they could blame for this. Contrast that to Etsy going live from their data centers into the cloud. First time, so we've been working for 9 months. We're go live week. First time we stayed up all night, had to roll it back, and we had a problem. And I'm just like, oh, this is gonna be bad. So I call my boss, the CEO. I'm like, this happened. He goes, why don't you try it again? Like that was it. That was it. Like,
That's great.
But why? So why do you think he did that? Like, why? What context? What relationship? What understanding allowed him to be able to say that?
Well, I think this is part of that like culture, especially at Etsy and some other organizations of like, one, he's a great leader, but also just this like things are going to go wrong. Like we know that, learn from it, and and I think he trusted us. He knew we knew what we were doing, and just needed another go at it. And we did. We spun around within I think 48 hours and launched, and they were live on the cloud and never turned back.
Yeah.
But I think that that particular boss like knew this is how to get the best out of people.
Yeah. So we're going to hit time here. This has been an amazing discussion. We could probably go another couple of hours on this, but I want to thank you both. If people want to find out more information about either one of you, John, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Yeah, email John@JohnWilliams, JON.
Awesome. And Mike?
Yeah, you find my writing on Fish Food for Thought, my blog.
Awesome. I'll make sure those are on the
by the way,
link profile.
Mike and I co-wrote a blog together on his blog about failure. So
we'll put we'll get it into the comments on the post so people can look that up. Thank you both so much. This has been a pleasure. Thank you everyone for watching and participating and for all the amazing notes and comments on this. This will go be recorded. You'll be able to watch it on LinkedIn as well. It's also on YouTube, so feel free to check it out there. John, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks.